What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is another 40k rules breakdown video. Today, we're going to be talking about devastating wounds and critical wounds, because the two kind of go hand in hand. Devastating wounds is a pretty divisive mechanic in Warhammer 40k, and just got a huge redesign in the recent Autumn data slate. We're currently under the authority of the Autumn data slate, so I'm going to be talking about the Autumn data slate version of the rule, which is very different from the version that you'll find in the core rulebook, but I will discuss the differences between the two. As always, if you enjoy these rules breakdown videos, please leave a like on the video, subscribe on the channel, all the YouTube stuff, and let's dive into it. Now, devastating wounds are a mechanic that triggers off of critical wounds. So we're going to start the video by discussing exactly what a critical wound is. A critical wound is simply a wound roll result that automatically successfully wounds the target. As a base level, an auto-modified 6 to wound is a critical wound. So even if you have no other abilities impacting your wound roll, a 6 on the wound roll dice will inflict a critical and trigger any additional abilities that critical wounds have. By themselves, critical wounds don't do anything besides being successful. There are no additional damage, AP, or saving throw modifiers applied to critical wounds. There's nothing special unless you have some sort of special ability. Devastating Wounds is a good example of that, and there are a lot of other abilities within the game that add some sort of effect to critical wounds, but you have to have that on your datasheet or in your weapon profile. Now, there are some effects that modify the result that you need to get in order to inflict a critical wound. The most common one, and the one in the core book, is called anti. Oftentimes, you'll find that weapons have an anti-some keyword, like anti-infantry, anti-vehicle, anti-tyrannid. These will all check the keywords that the target of the attack has, and on whatever number specified in the anti-ability, inflict a critical wound on that number or higher. This doesn't care about whether the wound would otherwise be successful. The anti-ability overrides the normal wound roll requirement. So for example, an anti-vehicle 4 weapon would automatically inflict a critical wound to a vehicle on a 4 or higher, even if the weapon was low enough strength to only wound it on a 5 or a 6. These being critical wounds will then also trigger any of their other critical wound effects, so you can find that units with anti-vehicle and devastating wounds, for example, will trigger devastating wounds on an easier number than just rolling a 6. Now, there are effects that modify your critical value but aren't the anti-ability. A good example of this is Celeste, whose leadership ability improves the critical wound value of its unit to a 5, but only on successful wounds. It's important to pay attention if you have effects like this that change what you need to roll for your critical wound, because in this case, it means that if the demonette unit that Celeste is joining would be punching something they would normally need a 6 to wound, their 5s in that case would not be critical. Only their 5s against a target that they would normally wound on 5s anyway. That just simply allows them to trigger their critical wound abilities like devastating wounds a little bit more easily if they would naturally wound the target on that number. That's very different than the anti effect, which is why Celeste doesn't contribute anti to the unit. Instead, it has its own bespoke critical wound effect. Now, another thing that's important to note when talking about critical wounds is the fast dice rolling rules of 10th edition 40k. In the base rules set, all attacks in Warhammer 40k are considered to have been rolled sequentially. You'll roll your hit, wound, saving throw, and damage for each individual attack before moving on to the next attack from that unit. That's not actually how the game is played, however, and that's because of the fast dice rolling rule. This rule allows you, if your units attacked all have the same characteristic and are affected by the same abilities, to roll all your dice together, your hit rolls and your wound rolls. You'll then pass those successful wounds to your opponent for them to assign saves as they see fit. It's important to note, however, that even if you have effects that trigger on critical wounds, you can still roll your wound rolls together, assuming that all those attacks are affected by the same critical wound effects. Now, lethal hits is another weapon ability that allows you on critical hits, that's normally hit rolls of an unmodified 6, automatically convert a successful wound with no wound roll required. Now, because there is no wound roll with a lethal hitting attack, there is no chance for that wound to become critical. So effects like devastating wounds or other effects that would trigger on critical wounds are not applied if you successfully roll a lethal hit. So with critical wounds discussed, let's move on to devastating and talking about how that rule works. Now, in the core rulebook, Devastating Wounds on a critical wound roll converts all of the damage of the attack into mortal wounds that are then assigned after the attack sequence. This was found in the initial release of 40k to be way too powerful because it allowed small, low volume shots to potentially kill many infantry models, especially if you had ways to either reroll your wound rolls to fish for those devastating wounds or guarantee that you got critical wounds with mechanics such as Strains of Fate. So this was changed in the Autumn data slate to simply make Devastating Wounds deal normal damage that is unsavable by saving throws that are then inflicted at the end of that unit's attack sequence. That's the version that we're going to be discussing today, and importantly, in neither case are effects like Feel No Pain affected by these. Feel No Pain isn't actually a saving throw, it's simply a roll to ignore damage. So whichever version of Devastating Wounds you're using, you're still able to take Feel No Pains against it. Now, in the post-data slate version, it is important to note that while the damage inflicted is very similar to mortal wounds, it isn't actually mortal wounds, so anti-mortal wound effects, like Feel No Pains that you gain against mortal wounds, are not affected. Now, in the post-data slate version of Devastating Wounds, the critical wound rolls from a devastating weapon inflict normal damage that's unsavable at the end of that attack sequence, meaning that after all of your saving throws have been rolled against all of the other attacks made by every single model in that unit, the devastating damage is then applied. This can create some bizarre situations where attacks that are critical are then pulled out of the attack sequence, which, if you're trying to maximize your efficiency by sequencing your attacks in a particular order, can kind of mess you up a little bit. So here we are in Tabletop Simulator just to illustrate a particularly complex situation in which we're trying to assign devastating wounds. We've got Magnus the Red over here, who has a combination of psychic weapons, all of which can gain devastating wounds from the Thousand Suns detachment ability. He has a 2 damage psychic weapon, which we'll have represented by the blue dice, and a 3 damage psychic weapon as well. He gives himself +1 to hit and wounds. He can give himself roll rerolls with the stratagem, so it's pretty likely that you get a lot of conversions with these weapons into a Terminator squad. Now, let's say, for example, that Magnus has elected to fire his 2 damage weapon first. This is an AP1 2 damage Firestorm of Tzeentch, and 3 of those wounds after rerolls have ended up inflicting devastating wounds. Now, because the devastating wounds are applied at the end of the sequence, they are pulled out of the normal sequence. So we're going to go ahead and shuffle these back over here. From there, the attacker gives the defender these 5 saves to make and to allocate as they see fit. So we could see, I think, potentially we have 4 wound Storm Shield equipped Assault Terminators here, and 3 wound Lightning Claw equipped Terminators. If we assume that the defender wants to blank as much of this damage as possible, they'd probably assign these to the Lightning Claw Terminators, take the saves on a 3-up, and we'll probably lose 1 Terminator in response to that. From there, Magnus then goes to resolve his 3 damage Gaze of Magnus ability. So again, assuming that we've rolled all of our hit and wounds, and we've gotten 2 critical wounds here, those are pulled out and kept to the side. Now, to my knowledge, there aren't any rules dictating the order in which these are resolved, so I believe that the devastating wounds at the end of the attack sequence are going to be inflicted in the order that you rolled them, meaning that the Firestorm 2 damage devastating damage wounds are going to be applied first, and the other one's going to be applied second. I don't know that for sure, though. It may be that there is a rule somewhere else governing that, or we will get a clarification of that in the future, but that's what I'm going to move forward with the assumption. So these are now 3 damage weapons, assuming that none of the other Assault Terminators have taken saves, so that they're forced to take these ones. We can now take these saving throws on the Assault Terminators with the shields, which will probably kill 1 of them. From there, the 2 damage attacks are allocated. These are unsavable because of the devastating wounds to the Terminators. Assuming that the other shield Terminator wasn't required to take any saves from the 3 damage attacks, that means that the defender could assign 2 damage attacks into 1 Lightning Claw Terminator to kill them, 1 2 damage attack into another Lightning Claw Terminator to leave them at 1. 1 set of devastating damage would kill them, and then another set of devastating damage could be applied to the other Assault Terminator to leave them at 1 wound. So this is a good example of a way that rolling devastating wounds can potentially, because it pulls those attacks out of the sequence, kind of mess up the particular sequence that you want to be doing and make it so that there's more control one way or another, either with the attacker or defender, over which models take damage. Especially for multi-damage devastating wounds in a unit with several damage characteristics, those attacks being assigned by the defender at the end means that they have the potential to, especially if if they have a couple different wound characteristics within their unit to mitigate the damage that they would take from that devastating damage somewhat. Now, if an attack has the combination of devastating and precision, the two abilities mesh together in a particularly weird way. Precision is the weapon ability that allows you to choose a character that you can see in the target unit of the attack that, when that attack is allocated, must suffer that saving throw. Devastating wounds are applied exactly like a normal attack. They are, for all intents and purposes, a normal damage that punches through armor and invulnerable saves. So they're allocated as normal, but because they're allocated at the end of the attack sequence, you actually get to see the result of all of your other attacks before deciding whether that devastating damage will apply to the character or the model in the unit. This is a pretty powerful combination between the two abilities, since the devastating wounds are automatically going to happen at the end, so you get the most control over them as the attacking player. Now, in addition, because the devastating wounds are normal damage, if you have an attack that does both devastating wounds and mortal wounds, like the old sniper rules from 9th edition, the devastating wounds are applied first. Normal damage, which is just damage inflicted by the attacking weapon's damage characteristic, is always applied first, then mortal wounds from other effects are applied after the fact. Now, I'm not sure that there's too many effects with both of these in the game, but if we do see more of them in the future, it is important to keep in mind that the devastating wounds are always applied first, mortal wounds next. Devastating wounds are one of 10th edition's wildest abilities. It's important to keep in mind the specific mechanics revolving devastating wounds and the critical wounds that create them in order to properly resolve these devastating wounds attacks so you're not shorted any attack efficiency. So I hope you enjoyed this breakdown of critical and devastating wounds. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.